Hey YouTube, welcome back to our channel. My name is Elena.
And I'm Björn.
And we are Viking Age reenactors and living historians here to talk with you about your favorite Viking shows.
Today we're taking a critical look at episode 21 of Vinland Saga.
That was a loaded episode.
Yeah, that was a good episode. There was political intrigue, there's manipulation, there's subterfuge, there's spies, there's like political interest, there's betrayal, just all over the place. We opened up with a little bit of a lecture about Vikings and slave trade. That was absolutely a thing. Mm-hmm. Vikings heavily participated in slave trade and slavery through many different cities and established trading points and everything, heavily in Ireland, as well as just kind of all throughout Scandinavia and the greater European continent that they traveled through. You could become a thrall, which is their term for a slave, essentially, from a number of different ways. You could, you could absolutely just be taken hostage after a raid. If your village was sacked by marauders or by raiders, you could just be taken as goods, essentially, and sold against your will, which is absolutely a thing, which is horrible. You could also just owe somebody a lot of money and essentially sell yourself into slavery as a way to pay off your debt. So you would kind of agree to an established point of time of like how long it would take for you to pay off however much you owed to a person. So you could also do it that way. Slaves or thralls did have some rights. They were allowed to marry and have children. Their children born to thralls would themselves be thralls. That was a thing. You were considered property. Just saying it straight out, it's a terrible thing. With that though, somebody else couldn't destroy that property unnecessarily. So like, for an example, Eric the Red got exiled because he killed somebody else's slaves. There was twice. He did it twice, so he didn't learn. And he got exiled from Norway and then from Iceland. But yeah, I mean, there his neighbors' thralls were working the fields, and there was like a rock slide or like a mudslide essentially, and he got mad and like killed the guys responsible, and then they took it up to court, and he was exiled for it. Literally twice, the exact same situation, they say. So there were some rights afforded to it. You were worth a fair amount. You know, it wasn't just like, chump change or anything. Like it was a proper investment, and there was also a rapport, an established relationship between slaves and their owners, essentially. So there absolutely were slaves that were treated very well and essentially treated like family, and they could earn their freedom or be given their freedom if they proved loyalty or did certain tasks and stuff. And there's various mentions in the Icelandic sagas of slaves earning their freedom and actually being gifted like a compensation, like a monetary compensation to go and like live their own life. If you were a freed slave, you would be considered a free man. You wouldn't have the exact same rights as somebody who wasn't a slave prior. You were still recognized as having come from slavery, but you still were afforded the majority of rights just like everybody else, which is something.
I think your weregild would still be lower than
exactly.
a proper free man.
Exactly, like that's one of the examples. Like your weregild, if somebody were to slay you, the value of how much they'd have to pay in compensation for your death was less than like a non-prior slave, a non-former slave's weregild. But I don't think it was by any like drastic amount. It was just a little less. Want to make the distinction, it was not indentured servitude. Like it wasn't this romanticized notion of just people hanging out and living their lives and just somebody working for the other. It was slavery without a doubt. You could be beaten by your owner and not really face consequences. And it could absolutely be a horrible life. But it's not like whipped to the back, huge plantation kind of thing. It was essentially a way to get extra hands on a farm. Or just for general kind of household use and stuff. Like their chores would just be like helping around, tilling fields, keeping the fire lit at home, or running errands and things like that. So I don't want to exaggerate how bad it was, but I also don't want to underplay it at all either.
All right, so a couple of quick topics here. So I noticed when they were pulling into York, the dragon heads were off of the ships, which is kind of interesting to me. We talked a little bit about this before, and I'm sure we'll talk about it again.
Yeah, kind of all over the place. We've talked about it.
Yeah. Vikings tended to keep the dragon heads on when they were raiding because it was meant to scare off the land spirits and the sea spirits and everything else. It was meant to cause chaos, essentially. But when they were pulling into port to trade or to rest or basically, just as a stopping off point here. Non-hostility visit, such as what they were doing in York. They would actually take the dragon heads off of the ships, and that was meant to, first of all, show off that they were in peace, that they were pulling into port in peace, and they weren't looking to raid there. So anyone that's in port doesn't have to run off screaming or try to take up arms or anything like that against them.
Yeah, they don't have to be worried about any kind of incoming raid.
Yeah, but also just to not scare the land spirits and not to piss them off and not to cause that type of a chaos. So that was a really interesting little detail in there.
Definitely.
I really, really liked.
Definitely. And in a similar strain, too, there's also mention that the Norse who would come to a foreign shore and not bring hostility with them, they'd actually wait by their boats to be like invited onto land. That's not like presume or overstep any boundaries or anything like that too. So you'd actually typically kind of like wait at your boat to be greeted and like welcomed and introduce yourself and like give the information of like who you are, why you're there, kind of thing too. So it was just a way to kind of show respect to the land and to the people there. Also of note, I thought that ship that the king was kind of sailing on too was very interesting because the carvings along the prow were very reminiscent of the Oseberg ship, which is beautiful. It's from a much earlier time period, about like a century and a half or two before this. I think it was late 9th century, if I remember correctly. I thought that was interesting. The quick drawings that we saw were just reminded me of that. This political intrigue was really cool. I loved seeing Askeladd kind of like lay out his plan. It was just really cool to see how he like manipulated the situation entirely, because he was absolutely kind of right. Like the king kind of had complete control over their position, and that's not something really you can really rely on. Because like he was kind of explaining in the beginning, the king can give a gift, like we talked about last weekend. Or last week, to honor the person for doing a deed, but he can still do so in a very political way as to benefit himself most and isolate that person still. And that's not something you want to put yourself in a position where you have to rely on their kind of goodwill, especially when you know that they're actively against you. So Askeladd was brilliant in kind of setting up this slave sacrifice, essentially, to give themselves the upper hand, because by putting on like a public show of force and targeting the prince who has the least kind of say or who's kind of trying to be pushed out, it lets the people see and like confirm and plot and kind of try to figure out that like, oh, the king probably demanded this because they're trying to push him out and they're trying to like discreetly kill him off, and he's trying to create that like civil unrest. So it creates a situation where the king has to act in Canute's best interest to placate the people and not create more distrust.
Yeah, and it's also kind of interesting because Sven did plan it so that Canute would get assassinated in his travels to England, essentially. Yeah. So I'm kind of curious to see where all of this I'm kind of curious to see where all of this is going to end up.
Definitely.
In that respect, because Sven might see this and realize that, he's made a huge mistake. And does he know, or is he going to figure out specifically what exactly happened? Is he going to think that that was the kill attempt that he intended, or is he going to know that it's a fluke?
Yeah.
Of some kind.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be a real interesting time.
Yeah.
The next 3 episodes.
Another quick note that I wrote down is the word pirate.
Viking.
I can't remember exactly who said it, but they were describing Askeladd. They call him Askeladd in the show. I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation or if that's just the Japanese version of it. But it's actually absolutely true. They called him pirate, and that's basically what Vikings were. When we say Viking nowadays, a lot of people kind of relate that to Norsemen either people from Norway or Denmark or Sweden, who attacked England, obviously, but also kind of lived within their communities. But Viking was what you did. You went a Viking.
It was a profession.
Yeah, it was a profession. You went raiding, and you went pillaging, and you went marauding.
But yeah, I mean, a Viking was a pirate before the term pirate came about. It's the OG pirate,
it's the OG pirate.
Yeah, OG pirates. Yeah, it was literally a seafaring marauder, a seafaring raider. That's exactly what a pirate is. So
yeah, basically.
But we don't have to get too into this, but the crossbow thing, I actually appreciated the use of the crossbow in this. That was brilliant.
I think that was the best use of a crossbow I've ever seen in any show.
Yeah, absolutely, because like the technology is so weird, because crossbows have been around since like the 1st century. They've just made appearances back and forth and been all over the place and all over the world. They developed, and it's on. I mean, I'm not surprised by that because it's literally just a bow on a stick. Like, it doesn't take that much effort to like think of it. You know, you maybe think why. You maybe ask yourself why, but it's a thing that existed for a long time and then fell out of use and kind of disappeared from history for a bit, and then kind of came back and was in the Frankish territory in like the 8th to 10th, 11th century and everything and onwards. But there's not really any like contemporary information to show that the Vikings actually encountered that kind of technology, or like the crossbow specifically. So it's interesting that they chose to use one and then called it out by having the people in Jorvik like pick it up and be like, what the hell is this? This is a weapon? What? I don't know. I've never seen this before in my life. What is that? It was just hilarious. Same kind of point with the clothing. We had issues with the clothing beforehand. Now we're starting to see some of these characters in more normal, kind of everyday dress in these places where they have to make an appearance as nobility and kind of show who they are. And it's great to see that kind of come into play because we're starting to see a little bit more traditional garb with like elaborate embroidery or colors and ornamentation. And that's really lovely. Viking clothing, there's not a ton of variety that we know of specifically, just because not a lot has survived. Linen and wool breaks down very easily in the ground, so there's not a lot of surviving examples of what it was. So we only have so many different varieties and cuts of clothing and styles and things, but we do know there are regional styles specific to Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and so on. But we do know that a way to kind of show wealth was to use color and decoration and ornamentation, like embroidery or sewn on tablet weave. It is basically just another way of like wearing your wealth. Very vibrant, pigmented, bright colors was a way to show that you were wealthy, because it essentially means that you could afford the clothing that was most richly dyed because it was the first to go in the bath, in the vat, and as it would get used more and more, the color would become more and more faded. So if you had these very bright, vibrant clothes that you were wearing, it meant that you could afford that expensive first dip in the vats, and then color too. Based on the rarity of materials or of pigments and flowers and stuff, that would also affect it. So like reds and blues were a little bit more rare, but also kind of more common too.
Yeah, there was also overdyes. We don't know exactly how much they were specifically used, but say to get the color purple. Purple was a very, very rich color that only, kings would have essentially, and that's because you had to first dye the fabric blue. Or red. I can't remember exactly what the order of events was, but you basically had to take a blue and a red dye, and first you colored the fabric blue, and then you colored red, and you get the purple, or vice versa. Either way. But to do that, because you had to go through 2 dye processes instead of just one, it was considered a very rich color. So if you wore purple, then that meant you just had all the wealth.
Yeah, exactly.
And
Absolutely.
You could afford it.
Yeah, definitely. And to kind of tie onto that too, especially in Northern Europe, like a lichen was actually used also as a purple dye in of itself to avoid having to do the over dye. But that was also a hard to afford material. So it was very scarce and only kind of found in like Ireland and in the Isles. So if you didn't want to have to over dye, you could also use the lichen, but it's still just as expensive, if not more so, to do it that way. And also you have to find a way to let the pigment set and take, because sometimes the pigment doesn't penetrate into the fibers that great, especially with like linen. It's hard to take. Wool is a little bit easier. So like you could dye something purple and then it gets washed out and faded really quickly.
Exactly.
And it's like, oh great. So if you had like a very rich, vibrant color, it showed that you actually, you know, had the time and labor and effort go into creating something that will last.
I like the way that the show is showing it off, because there is a scene that specifically shows it off very, very well. It's the scene of Floki and a couple of his guards, and all of them have the brooches that are holding up their cloaks, and the other guards have what looks like bronze brooches, very basic ones, and his has a little emerald on top of it. And that is such a perfect way that I feel like in the Viking Age wealth would have been shown off. It's not these extravagant furs and leathers that are gonna get thrown on top of your person.
Yeah.
It's the little things. It's those like little moments where you're going to see, oh, he has like a little emerald on his brooch. That means that he's a little bit more wealthy than the guards.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, that are following him.
Exactly. Like kind of yeah, it's like they try to, a lot of the times they try to do like layers essentially to like just add and add and add and add and add, and it's like, okay, well, sure, kind of, but at a certain point it gets just ridiculous and not even believable. It's about like visually like identifying and understanding what goes into like making it or obtaining the material essentially. Like a perfect example is the necklace that you wear, the Viking knit kind of chain woven thing. So early in like the Vendel period, in the pre-Viking Age, you see these torques, these neck rings that are like very bulky and like thick, complete gold chunky things, and it's a lot of material, absolutely. So it's just expensive by just sheer mass volume. And later on we start to see this refined technique of like weaving precious metal wire like silver and gold and things like that, and using it in tablet weaving and things. And even though it's less material, it takes way more time and labor to get something so refined and small and like intricate. Case in
Something
point.
like this.
So somebody looking at those two things would know, like, well, yeah, sure, that's a chunk of material, absolutely, and that's expensive, but like the amount of labor and effort that went into making that makes that more valuable than the other thing, you know?
You asked, didn't Sven only rule in England for like 5 weeks? I don't know what the exact number of the weeks was, but I know his rule was extremely short. He actually took over rule of England in 1013. I think it was in December, like toward the tail end of of that. And yeah, he died in England shortly after. I think it was only a few weeks that his rule lasted, and then he died. Womp.
Womp womp.
One last topic that we kind of wanted to touch on, and this has been a theme of Vinland Saga for us to talk about, because we talked about how characters would yell to Valhalla and like run into battle, and we've kind of made fun of it a little bit, but the concept of dying in a battle or dying in a fight, to whether you're trying to go to Valhalla or because you're trying to have an honorable death, which in this case it really did seem like he wasn't specifically trying to go to Valhalla, although I'm sure that was part of it, but he was trying to have an honorable death by not just dying by laying in his bed on top of his furs, basically.
Totally.
And I really liked the way that they showed that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I definitely think it was a Valhalla thing, but I'm really glad that they didn't like draw so much attention to it and like over explain it, I think.
Yeah. One of the moments that I had during that scene was when he said, "I really wanted to be your friend." You literally said that right after Askeladd apologized to you for missing your vital organs.
Yeah, right?
He was so concerned with giving you a very quick death, and you're just like, I wish I was your friend. It's like, dude, he is your friend. Thank you guys so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did, hit the like button. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you can be notified of our future videos, and we'll see you in the next one.